Imagine living where anything was allowed, where money bought any pleasure, where the parties lasted days and nobody cared about tomorrow. Sodom and Gomorrah were the companion of lust, of wealth and intelligence, more behind luxurious mansions and grandiose temples. There was one world of violence, boundless betrayal and perversion. Women were treated as objects, children were sacrificed in dark rituals, and the poor were left to die in the streets. Until one day, everything ended in flames. What really happened in these cities? What it was like to live in this place where morality just didn't exist. Discover now the dark truth about Sodom and Gomorrah. Wealth and luxury, the prosperity that led to arrogance. Imagine walking through a city full of vibrant markets, where traders trade gold, silver and rare spices. The smell of meat, roast and freshly baked bread takes over the streets. Men wearing luxurious robes negotiate. As servants, carry jars of oil and exotic wines. This was Sodom, a thriving shopping mall where wealth flowed without limits. But this prosperity brought consequences that few realized in time. Sodom and Gomorrah were located in one region, extremely fertile, close to the Dead Sea. Fields around cities were plentiful, supplying wheat, barley, and juicy fruits. Rich allowed the inhabitants to accumulate wealth. Quickly, trade prospered, with caravans coming from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other distant regions. The streets were busy, full of artisans, owls and merchants, displaying your products more expensive. The richest lived in luxurious houses, built with polished stones and decorated with fine fabrics, imported. In the city center, imposing palaces reflected the grandeur of its inhabitants. Most powerful, parties were common, bringing together influential nobles and merchants who flaunted their fortunes at dinners. Extravagant, the wine was never lacking, and food was served in exaggerated quantities. But there was another side to this wealth. Inequality was evident. While the rich feasted in great halls, adorned with gold and silver, the poor struggled to survive. In some parts of the city, women and children slept in the streets, ignored by those who had more than they needed. Asking for help was useless. Sodom's culture did not value compassion. Goodness was seen as weakness. Trade was also marked by greed. Tampered pesos were used to deceive buyers. Merchants charged absurd prices, and the powerful exploited workers without mercy. If someone went into debt, could easily be sold into slavery to pay your bills. Justice favored the richest, while the poor had no one to turn to. The city outside, it was a spectacle of wealth, but inside it was a place where arrogance and exploitation reigned. For those who had money, Sodom was a poison. For those who did not have, it was hell on earth. But Sodom's wealth brought something even worse. A society that believed to be untouchable. They thought they would never face consequences for your lifestyle. But the fate of these cities was already sealed, and its destruction would come overwhelmingly. What comes next might be exactly what you need to know on the true face of Sodom and Gomorrah. But if you believe that greed and selfishness still corrupt our society, declare your faith in comments. Right now, my trust is in God, not in the riches. Let's show there's a way better than the pride of Sodom. City architecture and organization. The outside world, the rot inside. If you arrived in Sodom for the first time, I would be impressed. From afar, the city looked like an example of civilization. advanced for the time. The walls were high, the towers rose over the hills, and the main streets were always full of life. Merchants shouted their offerings amidst hasty crowds, as priests performed rituals in grand temples, dedicated to pagan gods, but all it took was a closer look to realize that behind of this display of wealth and progress, there was an environment of uncertainty and decay. Sodom and Gomorrah were not small towns, were influential urban centers, located in a strategic location next to the Dead Sea. This positioning favored trade and communication with other peoples, making cities attractive crossing points for merchants and travelers. The architecture was impressive for the time. There were palaces, luxurious mansions, wide squares and temples. The houses of the richest were made of polished stones, with imposing columns and interior courtyards decorated with statues and mosaics. The squares were the heart of the city. During the day, these places were teeming with commercial activities. Traders traded fabrics, rare jewelry and spices. Some sold perfumes brought from Egypt, while others offered hand-embroidered rugs coming from distant lands. But at night, the scenario changed. The same squares that were used for commerce, during the day, turned into wild party sites and pagan rituals. Musicians played flutes and drums as crowds indulged in provocative dances, and religious, involving immoral sacrifices and practices. Despite all this apparent, the city was chaos for those who did not belong to the elite. The red streets and dark alleys were dangerous. There were no laws that really protected the weakest. Who was robbed or attacked hardly found justice. If a crime happened, the victim was often ignored. While the British continued their lives without any punishment, the judges and rulers were corrupted and only favored those who could offer them something in return. Poor neighborhoods were far from the central areas. In these regions, the streets were tight and dirty, full of improvised shacks. Residents lived in precarious conditions, without access to basic resources, while the rich feasted on marble halls. The poor struggled to get a piece of bread. And the worst, there was no compassion. The culture of Sodom and Gomorrah did not encourage charity, nor solidarity. On the contrary, those in need were seen as useless, and helping the weak was considered a waste of time. In the noblest areas, pagan temples dominated the scene. They were gigantic constructions designed to impress, were dedicated to different deities, many of them linked to fertility and pleasure. The priests who ran these temples had great political and economic influence. The rituals included extravagant banquets and that mixed religion with carnal pleasures. For many inhabitants, these practices were just part of the city's culture, but in reality contributed to an increasingly decadent society. Another curious element of the Sodom organization was the absence of a strong army. The city trusted so much in its wealth and its walls, high that he neglected military security. This arrogance would be a fatal mistake later on, when its destruction became inevitable. Outside, Sodom shone like a jewel. Inside was one rotten society, where only the strongest and most greedy survived. One city without laws, without piety, and without future. But what happened on the streets, it was just a reflection that was rooted in the culture of the people. As violence became part of everyday life, Sodom deeper and deeper into its own ruin. The world can ignore justice, but God sees it all. If you believe that true justice comes from Him, write in the comments. God is my judge. If you could travel back in time and walk the streets of Sodom at nightfall, I would see something impressive. The sound of music would echo through the squares, coming from houses lit by torches and halls, where the party never ended. Men and women danced shamelessly, intoxicated by wine and unbridled desire. In Sodom, pleasure was the only law, and any limit was despised. The city has become a stronghold of absolute hedonism. Parties started at sunset, and often lasted for days. Eat and drink to exhaustion was considered a status mark. The more extravagant the celebration, most respected was the host. In great noble palaces, offered banquets full of exotic meats, rare fruits and spices from distant lands. The wine gushed without ceasing, and the guests indulged in all sorts of excesses. On the streets, troubadours and dancers entertained the population. Rich men walked accompanied by servants and slaves, many of them forced to serve the wishes of their masters. Infidelity wasn't just common, was expected. The concept of marriage and commitment was ridiculed. Anyone who tried live with some sense of morality was a joke. The pagan temples played one central role in this culture of boundless pleasure. In sumptuous rituals, priests and priestesses promoted celebrations dedicated to the gods of fertility. Many of these rituals involved orgies and degrading practices. People believed that by surrendering to these acts would be attracting blessings for their crops and business. But in reality, we're just diving more and more in a spiral of depravity. The city was proud of having no rules. Morals, the motto was simple. If it gives you pleasure, do. But this search, capacity for personal satisfaction came at a price. Belief was not just in culture, but in people's hearts. Relationships were superficial, based on momentary interest and desire. True love will disappear, accompanied by need, insatiable from new experiences. The consequences of this were visible. The violence became common when the pleasures of a conflicted with the desires of other. Jealousy, betrayals and disputes ended in murders. In the dark streets of the city, the weak were exploited without mercy, and compassion seemed to have been completely erased from the hearts of the inhabitants. The foreigners arriving in Sodom were impressed with the vibrant life of the city, but soon they realized the truth. There you were, welcome, only if he was willing to submit to the rules of wantonness. If he tried to resist, was ridiculed and, in many cases, pursued. Sodom became a place where pleasure ruled. But ironically, the city was on the brink of ruin. The people did not realize that there, with excesses, was slowly destroying its own society. And what comes next is even darker. The violence on the streets of Sodom was not an accident. It was a reflection of the corrupted soul of its inhabitants. Before, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Each tanned and produced helps us get this message to more people. Violence and lack of laws, the danger hidden in the shadows. At nightfall, the streets of Sodom turned into a real hunting ground. In the city center, the nobles still celebrated in their palaces, but in the dark alleys, the reality was different. Who dared to walk alone could easily be attacked. Robberies, beatings, and even murders were common. And the scariest is that nobody cared. If a person was found dead in the morning, your body was simply ignored, or as if it were some garbage. The city was dominated by the law of the strongest. There were no fair rules or a reliable legal system. The rulers and judges were among the most corrupt. favoring those who could bribe them. If one rich man committed one crime, just offer one generous amount, and everything was forgotten. But if a poor man tried to seek justice, was ridiculed and often punished, thwarting the powerful. The foreigners who arrived in the city had an even worse fate. In many ancient cultures, hospitality was considered a sacred value. But in Sodom, the opposite happened. Travelers were seen as easy prey. Some were attacked and beaten, while others were publicly humiliated. It was not uncommon for groups of drunk men to surround outsiders and subject them to abuse and torture for pure fun. And the worst, there was no one to protect them. Violence was not only tolerated, was encouraged. Among the youngest, it was almost a rite of passage. Demonstrate cruelty against the weakest. The rich competed with each other to see who organized the wildest parties, often involving slaves and prisoners, who were forced to participate in brutal games. Empathy was gone. The suffering of others was just entertainment. Poor neighborhoods were the most affected, while the nobles had private guards to protect those who lived on the streets or in hovels had nowhere to run. The robberies took place in daylight, and nobody did anything to stop. Women and children were the most vulnerable. If they were kidnapped or taken as slaves, hardly anyone would come to your defense. The justice system, if it could be called that, was completely corrupt. If a trader, powerful, wanted to get rid of a competitor, all it took was falsely accusing him of a crime. The accused was arrested or killed, without any chance of defense. Trials were mere formalities, and the truth had no value. The arrogance of rulers was so great that they believed nothing could hurt. Sodom and Gomorrah. The thought was simple. We are the richest, the strongest, and the most feared. No one would dare challenge us. This false feeling of invincibility made the city sink even deeper into chaos. What happened on the streets? It was just a reflection that was in the hearts of its inhabitants. They had lost any sense of morality. Respect for life no longer existed. Each person saw the other as an object, an obstacle, or an opportunity for self. But what no one imagined was that the real danger did not come from outside. Sodom would not be destroyed by armies, enemies, or political disputes. Judgment was approaching, and it would come from one place no one expected. And now, you will find out to what extent this city has come in its decay, and because its destruction was inevitable. Sodom ignored those in need. But we can be different. If you believe that love of neighbor can transform the world, comment now. Jesus taught me. Let's make this message reach more people. The role of women and children, a society without respect for life. If a woman or child was born in Sodom, their destiny was practically already mapped out. This was not a place of protection, nor an environment where dignity was guaranteed. On the contrary, it was a society where the weakest were treated like goods. Disposable. Women had no value beyond its usefulness to men. From early, learned that their survival depended on your family's status or the marriage they could give up. Love was not the foundation of unions. Weddings were just political or economic agreements. A man could marry several times, accumulating wives as one who accumulated wealth. But if a woman was considered unwanted, could be abandoned, without any consequence for the husband, widows were among the most vulnerable. If they didn't have an influential family or own riches, were simply forgotten by society. Many ended up in the streets. surviving from charity that practically does not exist in Sodom. Helping the weak was seen as one sign of weakness. The children also did not escape this cruel reality. There was no concern for their education or well-being. The children of the rich had some education, but they were created to follow the same paths, greedy and immoral from your parents. Already, the children of the poor were exploited from an early age, forced to work or live begging for alms. Many children were sold into slavery, traded as if they were mere commodities. But the most disturbing aspect of this society was the relationship with pagan rituals. Many ancient cultures practiced human sacrifices as a way to appease their gods. And in Sodom, it happened in a shocking way. Children were offered on stone altars, burning alive in macabre rituals, to supposedly ensure good harvests or protection from enemies. A child's cry was ignored, for it was believed that his death would bring benefits for the city. Morality had already been completely erased. Human life had no value in a society where only pleasure and wealth mattered. The most vulnerable were the ones who suffered the most. And all this leads us to another aspect of this city, one of the most revolting. If the poor already suffered in tears, those in need were simply treated as if they didn't even exist. The poor were despised. A place without love of neighbor. Walk through the streets of Sodom was to see an absurd contrast, while the rich hosted jewels and banquets. In your mansions, the poor died of hunger a few meters away. The Bible mentions that one of the greatest sins of Sodom, it was his indifference to those in need. In Ezekiel 16:49 is written, "Behold, this was the iniquity of Sodom. Your sister, superb, breadcrumbs and thriving, peace of mind had her and her daughters. But never forget the poor and the needy. Selfishness ruled the city. People worried only with your own pleasures, without looking at who was around. Who was poor wasn't just ignored, often was ridiculed. If someone asked for alms, was kicked out of the square. If he tried to seek justice, was humiliated and threatened. Merchants had no mercy. If a poor man couldn't afford it, received nothing. There was no compassion, nor help, nor any kind of solidarity. In Sodom's mentality, if someone was poor, it was because he wasn't strong enough to survive. And it ended, further fed the culture of exploration. In many ancient cities, foreigners were received with hospitality. But in Sodom, it was the opposite. If a traveler arrived in the city without riches, was at serious risk of being attacked, humiliated, or even killed. The simple fact of being an outsider was reason to be exploited or ridiculed. And that coldness wasn't limited to the unknowns. Even within families, love was disappearing. Brothers betrayed brothers. Parents despised children. Children abandoned elderly parents. The concept of community had been replaced by the idea of survival, individual at any cost. Sodom and Gomorrah were completely rotted inside, not just by perversion and violence, but for the total absence of compassion. But every city that builds its foundation about selfishness and pride, one day it collapses. And to Sodom, that day was closer than its inhabitants. Imagined arrogance destroyed Sodom, but brings us closer to God. If you believe it, write in the comments. God restores my life. The last day of Sodom, when sin brought destruction. The day started like any other. The sun was shining on the palaces and markets of Sodom. On the streets, the merchants shouted their offerings. The rich houses organized new banquets and pagan temples. were ready for another day of profane rituals. The city pulsed, immersed in luxury, in arrogance and pleasure. For the inhabitants of Sodom, that was just another day of excesses. But no one imagined it would be the last. The night before, something unusual had happened. 2 Polish outsiders had arrived in town. The news spread quickly, and a group of violent men decided that these visitors would not leave unharmed. What no one knew was that these men were not just travelers, were angels sent for a specific purpose. Destroy the city. The house where the angels were staying was surrounded. The inhabitants demanded that they be handed over to them, showing, once again, the perversity that dominated Sodom. But something unexpected happened. One blinding light blinded the attackers, leaving them stunned and powerless. That was one sign. Sodom's time was over. At dawn, the angels spoke with Lot, one of the few righteous men who still remained there. Get out of here, take your family, and don't look back. This place will be destroyed. The warning was clear and definitive, but still, there was the hesitation. After all, how to abandon everything suddenly? How to accept that the city where they lived for so many years would be reduced to ashes? As the sun rose over the horizon, Lot and his family fled, in a hurry through the city gates. The rest of the population kept living like nothing was happening. And then the moment came when the story of Sodom and Gomorrah would change forever. The sky that until then was blue and bright started to get dark. Heavy clouds came out of nowhere, bringing a strange and suffocating feeling. The wind changed. A heavy train took over the city. People started to wonder what was happening. And without notice, the first ray of fire fell from the heavens. Seconds later, flames began to plummet like a hellish storm. In slew and fire, consumed everything they touched. Rich houses fled. Temples burst into flames. Markets were destroyed in moments. Men and women ran desperately, trying to find shelter, but there was nowhere to run. The heat was unbearable. The air was filled with smoke and screams of despair. Mansions that were once a symbol of luxury and ostentation, now it was just piles of ash. The streets that were once drenched in festivals and sins were now covered in charred bodies. Those who tried to escape were consumed quickly by fire. It didn't matter if they were rich or poor, powerful or slaves. That day, all were facing the same fate. The city that for so long challenged any sense of morality now became a desert of destruction. But amidst the chaos, a small group ran across the plain, moving away from the hell that consumed Sodom. Lot and his family were alive, had escaped, but the warning had been clear: don't look back. It was then that his wife, taken by the attachment to the city, made a fatal mistake. She stopped, turned to look, and in that instant, your body... In seconds, she turned into a statue of salt. His heart still belonged to Sodom, and so it had the same end as the city. When everything fell, what was once a thrivings, now it was just a desert of smoldering ash. Nothing left. No trace of your past glory. Just charred ruins and the smell of sulfur in the air. The city that for so long believed to be untouchable had been destroyed in a single day. The pride, perversity, and lack of compassion brought Sodom and Gomorrah to its end. And this story serves as a powerful reminder. No civilization, no matter how rich and powerful it may be, survives when you choose to challenge all the principles of justice and kindness. If this story impacted, leave your like now as an act of reflection on the importance of choosing a path of righteousness. That was just the beginning. Betrayal has always existed, and even in the cloud, We find shocking stories of women who were unfaithful to their husbands. But what were the consequences? What happened to them? Click now and discover the most impactful cases of treason in Romania and the lessons we can learn from him